To the courtroom, a Tyler man charged with engaging in organized criminal activity has taken a plea deal and will get 6 years of probation. 20-year-old Jaquaylin Pettigrew pled guilty to deadly conduct today, a lesser charge than engaging in organized criminal activity. The charge stems from the Valley Blues shooting at the club in late December, where one person was killed and another was injured. Our Alex Weister has more tonight on what led to that lesser charge being offered and how the state says Pettigrew may have been acting to protect a family member.
Issue on the court's deferred adjudication probation for a period of 6 years.
That was the sentence for Jaquaylin Pettigrew following a plea deal which will see his charge lessened to deadly conduct, a third-degree felony instead of the second-degree felony he originally faced.
Upon investigation into this case, I believe that it's appropriate to reduce the case to the predicate offense.
According to Smith County Assistant DA Brian Giral, Aaron Johnson fired first, killing Aaron Jackson. Pettigrew, Jackson's cousin, fired back at Johnson to try and defend him, but did not hit anyone.
Mr. Pettigrew was reckless about shooting at a vehicle, discharging a firearm at a vehicle. He was reckless on whether or not it was occupied. The forensics don't support that his weapon was the one that caused the death of Mr. Jackson.
Giral says Johnson is responsible for both killing Jackson and the other injury in the shooting.
And I think there's going to be additional charges following the other shooter, Mr. Johnson.
Giral says the charge was lessened due to lack of evidence pointing towards Pettigrew acting within his role in his gang and only acting to protect his cousin, saying that he still fired in a crowded area, and if there are any violations of his probation, he will be arrested again.
I will tell the court and Mr. Pettigrew that if there is a revocation, we'll be asking for gang finding, we'll be asking for the maximum sentence.
Alex Weister, KLTV 7 News.
Pettigrew is ordered to not socialize with known gang members or have any drugs or new offenses. As part of his probation, he will have his social medias audited and must complete his GED.